Biden administration. Now, while the US is looking inward, the other countries represented on this panel still depend on trade as an engine for growth and prosperity. They need a rules-based system for trade and investment that offer their firms a degree of certainty when operating beyond their own home markets. But, as we have heard, there are some negative externalities of economic integration, such as the outsourcing of the stricter environmental standards that we need to tackle climate change, and also the weaponization of economic interdependence that some countries use to achieve foreign policy objectives. Many countries have therefore concluded that they need to address these negative external effects of trade and de-risk their economic relations with other countries. But the problem is that international politics move at a much faster pace than the trade and investment decisions of firms. So government may make strategic decisions and set incentives for the future, but it takes many years for firms to adapt to new value chain realities. So the Jacques Delors Institute and the Observer Research Foundation are writing a study for the Swedish Confederation of Enterprise, which we'll be publishing in the coming weeks. And we are looking at this question, how the EU and India can play a role in de-risking global value chains. We find that there is indeed a lot of potential in this relationship, but that the current trajectory is just not enough to de-risk international trade. As we have heard from Anna, India's share in the European Union's import basket has hovered around 2%, while the European Union imports from China are 10 times as large, and the share in the European import basket actually has continued to grow over the last decade. European companies are amongst the most important investors in India, but they have also become less important over the last decade compared to investors from other economies. And one key problem is that European companies in India are mostly producing for consumption in the Indian market. So if India wants to be serious about replacing China as a global manufacturing hub, it has to lower tariffs for intermediate goods and also work much harder to improve its transportation systems so that it can become competitive with countries in Southeast Asia. And if this does not happen fast enough, there is a risk for India that other countries will become the greatest beneficiaries of the reshuffling of value chains that is beginning to take place right now. Now, if the EU and India want to change the trajectory they are currently on, they must find a new framework for their economic relations. And that begins with concluding the negotiations for trade and investment agreements that restarted last year after being dormant for almost a decade. But the market access that the European Union seeks goes beyond what India has offered in any other trade agreement. And it would require a very fundamental shift in the Indian government's current industrial and procurement policies. On the other hand, as we've heard from multiple speakers here, there has been a shift in the institutional setup in the European Union. In the 2009 Lisbon Treaty, EU trade policy must align with the European Union's wider political objectives, and the European Parliament has gotten co-decision power, so that means it can veto any trade agreement that is tabled. And this has given a much greater voice to European civil society, which means that labor and environmental standards are an important part of the EU trade agenda now. The problem is there is a perception gap, and in India, sustainable development standards are seen either as a form of hidden protectionism or as a form of neocolonialism. So while India has to think deeply about its industrial policy and procurement frameworks, The EU will also have to do much better to communicate its sustainable development policies to Indian policymakers and find new constructive ways to work together with Indian policymakers and Indian society to build trust. For example, the EU could accelerate technology transfer for cleaner production methods of steel and aluminum and offer more climate financing to offset some of the negative impacts that its environmental trade policy objectives will certainly have for Indian exports. The new EU-India Trade and Technology Council that was launched last year could also complement these trade negotiations. In this council, the EU and India now have structured discussions around strategic technologies, such as artificial intelligence, quantum computing and semiconductors, green technologies like clean energy, and resilient value chains, such as access to critical components and raw materials. But if the EU and India want to reconfigure global value chains in the coming years, this will just not be enough. Without a binding new trade and investment framework, the economic relationship between the EU and India will just not reach its full potential and reconfigure global value chains so that India can become a global manufacturing hub that replaces the role of China. Now, if the leadership in Delhi and Brussels realizes this, I do certainly hope that this will encourage the two sides to come together and finally make the EU-India trade agreement a reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, it says time is up, but I was also promised to be here until 10 to 3, which means we can have 2 questions. I think there's like, oh my God, so many hands. So please, the floor is yours. There's 2 hands there. There's a lady here. Can you keep your questions to 30 seconds? Can you? And we'll keep our answers to 1 minute. Please. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Patrick Kugel, Polish Institute of International Affairs. I have a question to Minister Verma. A very simple and obvious question. Actually, when the FTA negotiations were relaunched last year, there was a very ambitious deadline and goal set up, which means that they need to be finished, concluded until the end of 2023, which means we have still 10 months to meet the deadline. So the question is, how hopeful you are that you can meet the deadline and conclude the negotiations by the end of this year, and what needs to be done or what needs to happen to allow you to conclude the negotiations, and also what would be the future of the negotiations given that both India and the European Union will enter election year next year. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for the very important question. Time is up also for the negotiations. So, second question. Yes, please. Let's take 4 very quickly. Very quickly. Let's try to be as democratic as possible on the questions after having exhausted the time. Come on.
I'm Dominique from Ivory Coast and based in Ghana. We know that Ghana and Ivory Coast together are producing more than 50% of the cocoa consumed worldwide. But sadly, I eat Ferrero Rocher and Lindt. There is no local chocolate in Ivory Coast. Fact 2, in my field of work, North American vehicles are representing more than 70% of the used car population in Nigeria and Ghana. But to repair those cars, we cannot have access to the data due to US export regulations. Shouldn't we talk about fairness, consistency when it comes to dealing with Africa?
Thank you so much. Anybody you want to, because not everybody can answer that question. Do you have a preference on who should answer? Okay, one person will answer. Please, one more question. Over there, yeah. Yes, and these 2 ladies, and that's all I could see.
My name is Matthew Asada, University of Southern California. I want to ask about, at the Center on Public Diplomacy, and I want to ask about public support for trade, because most of you on the dais right now are trade proponents, but we also know that there's a lot of skepticism about it. I want to ask about the language that's used for trade. If you mention trade, it probably has a negative reaction, most of the population. But if you talk about securing the supply chain, securing access to resources, ally and partner reliant, what can we do with the language that we use for trade to get more support?
Okay. Yes. One question each. So we are up to 3. There's actually 2 ladies here. Yes. I realize. It's hard. Let me tell you, there's lots of hands. So please.
Hi, I'm Tanya. I represent the United Nations Hult Prize Accelerator, so a lot of the UN SDGs-based startup ideas, and I also work with KPMG for the TMT vertical globally. My question is directed to Anna, and also taking from what Sanjay said about the demographic dividend of India. If I look at the industries that you've specifically mentioned in this report, and given that we split it across 4 decades of skill building, which leads then to also reverse exports into EU when the technology transfer is done. I would like you to help us understand how that plan could be actioned. And that's the question. Thank you.
Wonderful. Lady there, please. Yes, I know. We're going to take 6 questions because Nicola counts and probably Prime Minister Abbott. So this means we can take 2 more. So the lady here, please, quickly. We don't want to let people without any dessert. So 2 more questions and 1 minute each.
Hi, I'm Dr. Swasti Rao from the MPIDS, and I work on the Europe and Eurasia Center. So I follow these developments very closely. I have a very brief question, and especially to our friend from Germany, which is that the EU-China trade and investment deal has been stuck over human rights issues. And lately we saw that those human rights talks have been resumed. So how do you see that development happening? We in India track that very closely as to what your relationship, and especially the economic relationship with China, is going in what direction. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There is a gentleman, standing there. Last question.
Thank you, Chair. Myself, Priyadarshi from RIS, New Delhi. I have a straight question to Madam Speaker from Sweden. You know, you presented the numbers which are quite exciting for the crowd here, which implies that European consumers liked Chinese goods for years. It says that Chinese goods are probably high quality. It maintains all environmental sustainability norms, human rights conditions, labor standards. That's why Europe continue to import from China so much. Now, if that is the case, then why not other countries could come in? So is it the motivation for you to go for low price, which Chinese goods happen to be, or it is Chinese goods are high quality goods that you demand in any of the free trade agreements that you are negotiating?
Thank you.
That is one. The corollary to that is,
there's only time for one question. And your question was very good.
EU comprehensive investment agreement, which was signed a couple of years back, had a provision that China would buy more.
I'm sorry. I'm not going to take the second question. I'm sorry, because I've been told right here that we only have 2 minutes for 7 questions. So you pick your question. You have 30 seconds.
The timeline on the FTA India-EU, let me say that the political leadership sees 3 great advantages in this. One is, of course, the size of the Indian market, the demographics. 2, that we as a major energy consumer are part of the climate change debate and how we transition. And 3, because of a geostrategic location pivotably placed in the Indian Ocean and being a net security provider and a first responder. I think all these together are great cases that the political leadership will try and push this ahead. We will have to get the bureaucracies on both sides and a limited interest interests in business to also look at this to hasten the process. As a bureaucrat, I can admit that sometimes we feel that the sun, like the rooster in the morning, that the sun rises because you have sort of awakened it. But we will be guided by political directions here, and we are hopeful that in the timeline indicated, we will reach a favorable and mutually acceptable agreement.
Thank you. Who wants to take Andreas? There was a question addressed to Anna and Andreas, at least that directly. Yeah.
Yes, but I need to comment on the one on the language about the non-support, public support on trade, because my country, Sweden, is the country in Europe where we love trade. The public opinion for trade is sky high. It actually is a huge exception. And I would just like to say a word about that, because we single out.
You choose your
trade
answer.
Unions are hugely positive. Businesses are hugely positive. All political parties are hugely positive, because we have explained it for many generations. Sweden is a small country. We would be eating potatoes without trade. Trade with the rest of the world makes us more wealthy, and with this wealth, we pay for a top-of-the-line welfare system. We have parental leave, schools, we have a system with good health care, we take care of our infrastructure, so it's what you do with the money that actually gives the support to trade. So for Sweden, trade equals welfare.
Thank you. And I know there's a question you'll have offline because we don't have time. Andreas, there was a question for you right there on human rights and trading with China. I'm sorry, it was there.
Yeah, but the partnership to China is for all.
Yeah, I know, it's for everybody.
Sorry for that, but I said it's not a discussion either or. We need the Chinese market, and yes, I was the former Minister for Transport and Digital Infrastructure in Germany, and I was twice in the cabinet of Angela Merkel, and she had all the negotiations with China with the human rights discussion. Yes, we should make it together, yeah, we should mention the problems, but also the partnership.
Thank you. I'm sorry that I can't give you the floor. You want a floor? Yeah. Okay.
Very briefly, I try to answer to the professor.
Sure.
Yes. I mean, many countries, many people now, especially for the advanced countries, if the government says proceed, there's some kind of the trade pact, which means that they just accept that, oh, yeah, government is now doing very foolish things, because a trade pact means job loss. Yeah, that was the image, but that is a very wrong image, because in many cases, job loss and the widening income disparities due to the technological progress, and also the bad domestic politics, and that was the main reason, but not the other trade. So we need to, but we need to accept that this kind of the reality, and we need to pursue the trade liberalization again. But we need to develop the other types of things as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm going to stop it right here before we're thrown out of this room. Thank you so much for your attention.
I'm soon to be Director of Defence and Strategy at ASPI as well, and very much look forward to that role. So just before we get into the questions today, reflecting on the last decade is definitely pertinent as we cast forward to those decades that are yet to come. We've had a war in Ukraine, which is ongoing, of course, the global pandemic, escalating competition